welcome to the Ecomodernist channel live. You can check us out every Sunday at 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern. So welcome to the program, Daniel.
Thanks for having me.
I understand you consider yourself somewhat controversial, but that's not hard to do in the field of nuclear engineering and nuclear advocacy.
Admittedly not, I suppose. Arguably, being in nuclear advocacy itself is kind of controversial, I guess. So
Yes.
I guess I'm extra controversial, maybe.
Well, we love to fight one another exactly how we're going to save the planet, exactly how we're going to promote our favorite energy source, which is clean nuclear energy. So what's your real focus?
Well, I guess as a good example of that, you'll note that we are 1 year almost into a genocidal war in Ukraine. And you'll notice that the US has pressured many European countries, very notably Germany, to give up on Russian gas. And yet the US itself has not seen fit to issue a similar embargo on Russian uranium. And why is that the case? Well, the answer is quite simple. Half of the world's enrichment capacity is in Russia. You ban Russian uranium and all the plants close, all the lights go out. US policy on nuclear fuel fabrication, certainly outside the US, but to a great extent within the US as well, has essentially been that all fuel fabrication, whether it be enrichment or reprocessing of waste, is a proliferation concern. And therefore, the most important job in nuclear non-proliferation policy is to minimize the fabrication of fuel worldwide. People who do obey the US tend to be the US's friends. And therefore, the only people who got fuel fabrication, because they didn't listen to the US, tend to be US enemies.
We're sort of the bully of the classroom, and everyone's our friend, not because we reciprocate, but because they're our crew.
This is a general pattern in U.S. Foreign policy. They're wedded to the idea of U.S. dominance, full spectrum dominance, and we just can't do it no more. I mean, they've been trying to push around China, but China has, I think, $1 trillion that it has in treasuries or something like that. And recently, the Chinese, said, we're going to sell a big chunk of those treasuries. And like the U.S. is, they're frightened of that. Janet Yellen had a meeting with the Chinese and says, can't we get along? I mean, we're cruising for a bruising. We're trying to suppress the Chinese chip industry at the same time that the Chinese control
The
rare earth elements.
The rare earths.
Yeah, the rare earth elements. They're all produced in China. I mean, all the Chinese have to say is, you ain't getting no more. And we'd be shut down. I mean, it's crazy, It's just, it's against our national interests to be doing these kinds of things.
We host nuclear weapons in places like Germany and other places throughout Europe. We host nuclear weapons throughout the Pacific. We do all these things just to flex on our enemies. And so it's not that these people are necessarily our friends. We don't want them to get too powerful by themselves. We want them to be proxies for us. And so I kind of understand what you're getting at with India.
Perspective, they never promised anything, right? From the beginning, they said that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is bad for developing countries, right, without nuclear weapons, because what the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty basically says is that countries that don't already have nuclear weapons never try to get nuclear weapons. Countries that do have nuclear weapons, think hard, if you have time and effort, about reducing them. It doesn't matter. We're not giving you strict deadlines on when to get rid of nukes. That is highly unfair, and they never promised anything.
This is absolutely going to be controversial on sort of the progressive left, the democratic left in the U.S., is that we're definitely against proliferation of nuclear weapons because we hate war. And this is sort of the Michael Schellenberger perspective on it, is that a developing nation, a nation which is vulnerable, like, for instance, Ukraine is vulnerable to conventional warfare, would fare far better if they had nuclear weapons. And so this is the perspective that we could have on India. India and Pakistan had many bloody conflicts, and those are gone now that they're both nuclear powers. They are at a stalemate. This is preventing war. This is preventing thousands to tens of thousands to millions of people dying in a conventional conflict. The controversy, I guess, is about brinksmanship and the idea that we are going into a conflict with Russia brings that brinksmanship back to a focus. And it's very, very difficult to swallow as someone who has a good knowledge of the nuclear brinksmanship of the Cold War, and I was still alive during the end of the Cold War, and so it puts me in great conflict. You've described to me the Section 123 of the U.S. Atomic Energy Act. See, this is called the gold standard of nuclear technology transfer, and so the U.S. and the UAE entered into a 123 agreement, and that's resulted in a lot of assistance to the UAE from the US. We have engineers going to the UAE. Folks like Jim Conca are happy to go and consult with different municipalities there about whether or not they should construct another set of reactors. And it's a really good program. It's the first international reactor start outside of China following the Fukushima Daiichi disaster. So what is it about this agreement with the UAE and the 123 in general that could be harmful to nuclear technology transfer?
Well, first thing to sort of correct you on something, any countries that want to import US technologies or US reactors or US fuel are required to sign what is known as a 123 agreement based on Section 123 of the U.S. Atomic Energy Act. That is not terribly unique. I believe something like 40 countries have signed agreements with the U.S. about this. A big part of what the Section 123 says is that any foreign country that buys U.S. nuclear reactors, fuel, import technologies must, in future, ask the U.S. for permission if they are enriching fuel or reprocessing waste. Signing 123 agreements require discussions in Congress. What the UAE decided to do was that to speed up that discussion, they're going to sweeten the deal. So they essentially promised that they are never even going to ask for permission to enrich fuel or reprocess waste. But essentially, they swore off making fuel, they swore off reprocessing waste, just to make Congress and the Obama administration reach a decision faster. And Obama basically said, that's a great idea, right? We're going to call this where future partner countries swear that they are never going to touch the fuel cycle ever again. We're going to call this specific deal the gold standard. And so the UAE basically invented the gold standard. They are sort of touted as a good example of US non-proliferation policy until recently. So what the UAE did was that in their agreement, they said, you remember when we said that we weren't going to touch the fuel cycle? That part becomes null and void if any other Middle Eastern country gets enrichment or reprocessing, right? And why that becomes a problem is now that Saudi Arabia, as I'm pretty sure you and a lot of your audiences know, are extremely interested in getting nuclear technologies. For various political reasons, Saudi Arabia would prefer that that technology comes from the US. But Saudi Arabia also regards the fact that its fuel cycle is being restricted as being against its national sovereignty. Right? And so the US now has a conundrum. It can continue asking Saudi Arabia to not enrich or reprocess, in which Saudi Arabia is going to import reactor technologies from Russia and then possibly make their own fuel anyway. Or they can allow Saudi Arabia to enrich and reprocess and buy US technologies, and then the UAE gets to be able to do that as well. And so essentially, the build out in Saudi Arabia is now stuck, essentially, because of this problem. And this problem wouldn't have occurred if the US had just not been so anal about fuel cycle technologies.
If the IAEA has such oversight over nations that we're worried about, then what would be the problem? Why does the US need to meddle in that international process when the IAEA is able to monitor and audit this process?
The more technical and I suppose more spicy answer is that the IAEA is essentially created for the US to be able to do all this kind of meddling, right? I mentioned that half of the world's enrichment capacity is in Russia. This is part of a very long-term effort to build what was known as an international fuel bank. So the entire rationale behind establishing international fuel banks is to basically assuage countries from being concerned about the fact that only very, very few countries in the world are even allowed to create nuclear fuel. It's a layer of, I'm just going to say it, laundering of where the fuel comes from. That's the kind of thing that the IEA does. Honestly, I find those inspections very intrusive and frankly rude. To give an extreme example, I'm from Taiwan. By virtue of having a Taiwanese passport, I am not allowed to set foot in IEA headquarters in Vienna. Why the hell are they allowed to send whoever they like to go to our country to inspect our reactors? Like, that's just obscene. Sort of a more general point is that there is something called the IEA Additional Protocols, which all future pursuants of 123 agreements must abide by. The Additional Protocols is sort of a wide-ranging list of safeguards that countries are supposed to abide by. And one of those requirements is that the IEA can, in theory, just land an inspector inside your country, and then that inspector is allowed to say, all right, you've got 2 hours, I need to see this part of this plant, take me there now. Politics aside, I think, just the logistics of getting the IEA inspector from any international airport to any nuclear plant in the country is tough.
Yeah.
Taiwan is a very small, very infrastructure-dense country. And I actually ran Google Maps, right? If an IEA inspector arrived in Taoyuan Airport, within 2 hours, they can visit 3 of our 4 plants. Nuclear Plant 3, which is all the way down in south, cannot be reached in 2 hours unless our Atomic Energy Agency charters basically a private jet to fly them there. And lo and behold, there actually is an airport which is not used anywhere else next to Nuclear Plant 3.
Wow.
And so basically, with this additional protocol, what it essentially mandates is that every nuclear plant has an airport adjacent to it, which is part of the cost, but is not there as part of the cost when you talk about how cheap nuclear energy is.
Right. Yeah, so that is an extra economic and infrastructure burden, as well as a climate tax on nuclear.
And also that Americans who lived through the Cold War can sleep soundly in their beds knowing that non-white countries are not building nuclear weapons.
Spicy.
I would have to give a little pushback there. The idea of inspection for nuclear proliferation is so that whatever nation it is not going wink, nod when it comes to the nuclear power plants. So if I'm going to have an inspector in an American plant, let's say, I don't want him to be an American. I want him to be a foreigner. That makes them more unbiased. So, and you know, another thing too, going back a little bit, we were talking about, the nuclear proliferation in terms of war. This thing about a country could have nuclear weapons makes us safer and everything. And all of that's true in terms of war. But when it happens, it's far more catastrophic. A nuclear winter would destroy the ozone layer, and a nuclear winter would go on for 10 years. I mean, you wouldn't be able to plant crops. You wouldn't have vegetation. in all or most of the world for 10 years. I mean, a nuclear war to me, is a more scary thing than climate change by far, even though climate change is pretty scary in itself. It's okay if you got 2-3 nuclear weapons. Let's say if you're Saddam Hussein, but if you're India and Pakistan, it takes it to a whole new level. And that's all I had to say about that.
Well, my response to that is that the United States is the only country that have used nuclear weapons on civilians twice. But frankly, such a country should not be mandating what other countries do with either their civilian program or their military nuclear program.
But I think the idealist internationalist perspective is that, well, as few people as possible should have these weapons. Is that something that we can hope to achieve? Or do we have any hope to elevate everyone's such that no one is going to go off at a hip with a nuclear weapon?
That is a big question, one which I do not have an answer for, but I know how you don't reach that idealistic endpoint. And that's by restricting everybody's enrichment and reprocessing rights for the sake of non-proliferation. In World War I, there was a technology that was made which basically allowed you to make fertilizer essentially out of thin air. Now, that same fertilizer can, and indeed was, used to make a bunch of explosives and IEDs. And yet we do not ban fertilizer production simply because we are scared of IEDs. And in fact, that would actually be horrific. You're talking about mass starvations in primarily developing countries, which will ironically lead to more war. Food security helps prevent war. Energy security helps to prevent war.
We need to sort of move past our paranoia about nuclear weapons.
Not as individual nations, as the US.
Right.
Other nations are not paranoid about them acquiring nuclear weapons specifically.
Because we got the guns, and we want to be the only people with the guns so that we can flex our muscles.
Time to call for action, right?
All right.
Nuclear advocacy should call to abolish Section 123 of the U.S. Atomic Energy Act. Just even from a purely selfish viewpoint of the American nuclear industry, this is bad. See all these SMR startups, some of them have rather exotic technologies like thorium, molten salt, fast reactors. None of those technologies make any sense at all unless you are also allowed to reprocess spent fuel. They aren't going to be able to sell them. Right. It will come and it will go, right? People are very optimistic about nuclear right now due to the combined, climate change, war, and, fossil fuel shortages. I'm willing to put money on this. What I'm going to predict is that a handful of countries are going to build 1 or 2 reactors each. Then they're going to realize that, hey, nuclear energy isn't all it's cracked up to be, especially, let's not do this anymore. Let's not build nuclear. And how do I know this? Because this is exactly what happened in the late 70s and early 80s. You also had a war. You also had global fossil fuel shortages. You had a handful of countries build 1 or 2 nukes each. That includes Taiwan. And then after they build it out, they say, hey, hang on, this isn't all it's cracked up to be. I still need to import fuel. And, it's on the whims of multiple foreign governments, which I may or may not like. Let's abandon this. The fact is, a lot of those countries have, including Taiwan. It's just going to happen again and again and again until the US allows these countries to make their own fuel, allow the nuclear energy to live up to its energy security promises. There is an interesting case study, which is Vietnam. Vietnam wanted nuclear energy. And again, for various political reasons, they wanted US nuclear technologies. They got as far as in 2016 actually signing a 123 agreement with the US. What the Vietnam explicitly wanted was the rights to make their own fuel. And then US foreign policy people basically told them that actually, no, you don't. Making your fuel is more expensive. You can get it cheaper from the international market. And I'm not sure if the Vietnamese were hoodwinked or if they went along with it simply because they had no choice. But they signed the agreement, and then they realized that, hey, wait a minute, this international market doesn't exist because it's not international. Why the hell are we doing this? Vietnam has the second largest reserves of oil and gas and coal of any country in Southeast Asia and South Asia, which they are allowed to burn freely. They're allowed to sell it to whoever without the US raising objections. Why the hell would they want to move on to nuclear energy when none of that is true?
That's tough. And I was about to ask you, like, if you had your preferences, which is the bigger enemy? Is it the US Section 123, or is it the IAEA inspectors?
It's definitely Section 123. But one thing, Section 123 predates the IAEA as it currently looks now. The IAEA basically does the bidding of the nuclear weapon states on this front. And if the biggest nuclear weapon state of them all doesn't have objections to the IAEA doing stuff, then we wouldn't be having this conversation.
How about the advanced reactors? How about the breeder reactors?
Breeder reactors make sense if you are allowed to reprocess the plutonium, or in some cases, uranium, if you're talking the thorium fuel cycle, from spent fuel. The US basically kneecapped its own breeder program so that it does not encourage other countries to pursue breeder programs and therefore want reprocessing. That is how US policy works, right? And this is also another example of how US policy with regards to other countries is just absolutely killing its own industry and needs to go away.
I'd push back a little bit about that. I've heard a little bit about how the IAEA is developing protocols when it comes to a fluid fuel reactor. You're going to have those cameras, those online monitoring. They'll have systems checking the balance of the reactor to try to detect a diversionary pathway. That means if something is snuck out of that fuel mixture, that the reactor would behave differently, and so those online monitoring systems would send up alarms at IAEA headquarters. And your alternative is, well, we really shouldn't be requiring anyone to submit to these inspections and to submit themselves to online monitoring or tamper-evident seals on every reactor vessel. Is that accurate?
Yes, because no other energy source works like this. And frankly, should we want them to?
Well, I think the fortunate thing is that when fossil fuels operate, we can see the damage because the damage and destruction is immediate and evident and acute. And fortunately for nuclear, there is no damage for nuclear energy. There's
you want that to be
it's fortunately.
Yeah, it is. It's fortunate that nuclear has no damage, no destruction as the normal means of operation. It's only this ethereal risk that something out there will become a weapon at some point, or it will somehow go, like the anti-nukes will say, oh, well, it could blow up any minute, which is totally irrational and nonsensical. Even the Zaporizhia plant in Ukraine, if that was hit directly by anything but the most intense bunker-busting technology, it would not have a problem. And even if it was hit, it would only be a very small local contamination. So this is like, nuclear is absolutely not a risk when it comes to that. But what we're talking about is if the technology sneaks out, if it escapes the control of the IAEA, then that country could develop a weapons program. So let me switch gears. How likely is it that an independent nation would develop a nuclear weapons program without an energy program? And how could we detect that program was being developed? Because anything could be a nuclear weapons factory.
Well, first of all, just to say, right, there are 9 countries with nuclear weapons right now. All of them, with the exception of India and Pakistan, got their nuclear weapons before they had a civilian nuclear power program. And so basically just restricting civilian technologies isn't going to stop weapons proliferation. In which case, why the hell are we doing that? There's a expression in Chinese. It's called 官人能放火，百姓不能点灯. What that means is that, those in power are allowed to commit arson while telling the ordinary folk that they're not allowed to light their lamps at night. Because this is exactly what it is. And it's unreasonable and unfair, and we should get rid of it. The fact that US allies are not happy with the US because their fuel cycles are being restricted is not theoretical. It is extremely real. South Korea wanted a closed fuel cycle. They want advanced reactors for a very, very long time now. And the US has always blocked the access to any sort of reprocessing technology. First, South Korea wanted what we call wet reprocessing. Basically, it involves dissolving your fuel in acids, right? And then the US said no. The US says, but we're not actually restricting reprocessing for you, you understand, because Argonne National Laboratories have this thing called pyroprocessing, which is alleged to be more proliferation resistant. And then the South Korea went along with it, did some interesting chemistry and physics and whatnot. And then they said, right, we think we got a hang of this now. Are we allowed to commercialize it? And then the US said, no, actually, remember what I said about pyroprocessing being proliferation resistant? I lied. You're not allowed to do that anymore. Right? South Korea is so pissed. They call the US a nuclear Gestapo because of that.
Wow.
Right. This is not, it's not North Korea, South Korea, right? Longtime US ally compared you to Germans because of 40s Germany because of these restrictions.
Wow.
They need to go.
Right. So we're happy to let you speak where you're probably sidelined in many conversations. So let's give you more space to speak your mind, Daniel.
Thanks a lot. Where does a lot of anti-nuclear rhetoric come from, right, in general? So the fact that it's not safe, it's dirty, it harms the environment, we can do well with 100% solar and nuclear. Where does that sort of rhetoric come from? It comes from non-proliferation as well. Specifically, there is another US law called the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Act of 1978. And if you read that law, in Section 2, it basically says that it is official US policy to work with other countries, especially developing countries, to seek out alternatives to nuclear energy, which is consistent with environmental protection and the economic status of those developing countries. Later on, it will also go on to tell you that, in particular, they want to promote solar and wind as a replacement for nuclear and petroleum.
I'll agree with you, but I also want to say that after 3 Mile Island, this movement to vilify nuclear energy from the Green Left was very politically dominant.
The political left in the US has been very disappointing. Donald Trump had a phone call with the president of the most democratic nation in Asia. The left was up in arms about it. And then Joseph Biden fist bumped with essentially the God Emperor from this theocracy in the Middle East. Nobody raised an eyebrow. What kinds of internationalists is that, really? Yeah. I kind of want to go on a slight tangent. Solving climate change is hard. Solving climate change with nuclear energy is hard. To give everybody an idea, if we are supposed to reach net zero globally by 2060, that means that within 40 years, the world needs to build 4,000 nuclear reactors. And that's if energy use continues as it has, which it won't. It will grow, right? What that means is that every other day, there needs to be a new reactor build. And a lot of this needs to be happening in developing countries because that's where most of the energy use is going to be. That's where most of the carbon emissions are going to be. With these kinds of things, you cannot assume absolute security, right? I think that nuclear advocacy has gotten around to the point where we understand that absolute nuclear safety is nonsense. Absolute nuclear security, absolute non-proliferation resistant, those are just as nonsense, if not more so, right? Especially at the kinds of scales that we're going to have to build nuclear reactors if we want to solve climate change. And just, are we serious about that? I don't think so. Nuclear advocacy is happy that right now there are about 15 reactors under proposal globally, possibly, if we're lucky, getting built in 10 years. Like, this is short-sightedness.
And yeah, you're right. It is bleak. It is absolutely difficult. So I don't know where we're going to be at in the future if we don't relax some of these regulations. I see it only ending in disaster.
In my opinion, anyway, so climate change is one of those issues where it's no use meeting halfway. One of the sombering facts is that people don't really talk about is that if carbon emissions cease tomorrow, world's still going to be warming. Cutting carbon emissions by 20% is not cutting down hazards by 20%. And the view of a lot of developing countries, if you sort of read slightly about how various countries in Southeast Asia and Africa talk about, the COP and global climate, is that their opinion is that if you aren't going to be serious, then I'm not going to bother. But the consequences of climate change can be mitigated by their burning more fossil fuel. And if you're going to be so anal about their building sort of nuclear fuel, they're just going to burn the fossil fuel. Why would the hell would they want to use anything else? Right now, sort of the US loves clobbering other countries over the head with the fact that if you produce fuel domestically, it's going to be more expensive. Economic argument just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It cuts down on a lot of risks if you are able to source the fuel either domestically or from your direct neighbors. US policymakers and public have trouble understanding that things just work differently in other places.
The fact of the matter is that, at least, I mean, you could correct me if I'm wrong, but I've heard this from a pretty good source, is that it takes 17 years to break even on a nuclear power plant. Third world countries can only afford to invest short term. They don't have educated enough people to be able to do it themselves. The only countries that could do it would be advanced countries. But the thing is that it can't be done by buying them. The only way, if they're going to have a build out, is if the West actually just gives them foreign aid to do it, or whatever, West or China, whatever the case might be, Belt and Road, whatever it is, they can't do it themselves. They can't buy. They're not a customer, it seems. Am I right? I mean,
first of all, I find the comment about the non-Western countries being less educated to be somewhat offensive, if I'm going to be totally honest. Taiwan was previously poorer than Kenya, and I don't mean Kenya today, I mean Kenya back in the 60s.
Well, I'm not including Taiwan there. I'm talking about underdeveloped countries.
Only
underdeveloped countries.
Taiwan became rich, right? There's no reason why Kenya couldn't become rich and well-educated and all that.
Yeah.
But also secondly...
that's true. That's true.
Also secondly, just kind of, the kind of stuff that you're talking about is also part of why lifting restrictions on fuel fabrication is so important. You imagine that you are, I don't know, Nigeria, and you are thinking about, slapping down $10 billion to build a nuclear plant. And $10 billion is a lot of money. And you have to be worried about the fact that, okay, we're slapping down $10 billion and that plant needs to run for decades. This is a huge investment and a huge sort of financial risk. And then you have to worry about, wait a minute, right? In those however many decades, do I need to worry about the fact that my fuel might suddenly be gone because the US doesn't like us anymore? This is a big financial and political risk that they have to go through. And this can be mitigated a lot by simply allowing countries to enrich and reprocess, right? I would probably expect that most countries do not enrich and reprocess, even if all these restrictions are lifted. But
so let me bring us back to sort of the growing capabilities in Africa, and we have wonderful people in the international nuclear advocate community, and one of those organizations is the African Nuclear Congress. We speak with nuclear engineering students, and so this is really very important that we support these students. What's the best way to support a nuclear engineering student? Make sure they have a job in their field ready for them, and so much better if that job is local in their own country and they're able to actually produce a solution that's local to them. Right now, if you go into nuclear engineering, you're just as likely to go into mechanical or electrical engineering for a fossil fuel corporation instead, because we're so restrictive of this technology and we're holding all of these countries back intentionally, it seems sometimes.
There was an article by a very well-respected professor in, I believe, Princeton, can't remember off the top of my head, writing about this. And essentially all that professor can say, if you sort of boil everything down, is that no, you should not be creating nuclear weapons, or we'll sanction your electronics industry, we'll sanction your nuclear industry, right? We'll sanction everything you have, and when they will throw you to North Korea. How do you like that?
Oof.
That's how American diplomacy works. And it shouldn't be like this.
Well, let's leave it there. And again, the message from Daniel Chen is abolish Section 123 of the U.S. Atomic Energy Act. Allow countries around the world to develop their nuclear energy programs for the climate, but the American hegemony is holding us back. So again, from Daniel Chen, abolish Section 123. Thanks for watching the Ecomodernist channel live. I'm Carl Pauls. I'm here with Gabe Ignetti and our special guest, Daniel Chen. We broadcast every Sunday, 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern. You can find us at soyaddle.tv. That'll redirect you here to twitch.tv/soyaddle. You can find us online at esna.earth. And you can find us at YouTube/the Ecomodernist channel. And remember, emissions first, peace and justice will follow.
Please subscribe to us on YouTube, Ecomodernist channel. Also to subscribe to us on Twitter and Facebook, Ecomodernist Society of North America.
And online at https://esna.earth.